What's up, nerds? The United States and Ukraine are very close to signing a brand new security pact. This report from the Financial Times details a report that might be signed as soon as June on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. I want to note that the Financial Times has a bit of a track record of breaking stories that at the moment sound kind of like crazy and out of left field, but at the same time, after some time, they prove to be fairly true. One example would be their article on U.S. objections to Ukrainians striking on Russian oil infrastructure. And at the time, that seemed fairly doubtful. There were some reports that contradicted that. However, over time, that really became a pretty true article. I want to discuss what this agreement might include and why it's happening right now. And I also want to discuss what the motive is for the United States to get involved in this agreement, and more specifically for President Biden. And then I'll finally want to wrap up with the question on, will this bring the United States closer to war with Russia? Now, firstly, let's look at the agreement and what might be in the agreement. And as of now, which this recording is on May 31st, 2024, not a lot is known specifically. And by the time that you're watching this, more details may have emerged. But what we do know right now is that this will include assistance on training for new recruits, as well as intelligence sharing and economic assistance. To date, the United States has provided Ukraine over $175 billion in aid. And that figure is slightly deceptive. That's the total value of the aid that has gone towards Ukraine in this conflict, not necessarily the amount of money that has been sent to Ukraine directly. A lot of that money, in fact, the vast majority of that money, is actually being spent here in the United States, building up, factories, producing jobs. Basically, if old equipment goes to Ukraine, this includes old ammunition, then new ammunition and new modernized equipment gets created. So a lot of that money really, again, the majority of that money really helps the U.S. economy and the U.S. defense posture. But that is a total value of aid that has gone to Ukraine so far. Now, you might be saying, but Caleb, isn't the U.S. already sending aid to Ukraine? And isn't that assistance that the agreement might include already being done? So why do they need an agreement on this? After all, won't they just continue to do the same stuff? Well, yes and no. The agreement appears to be really just a formalization of what's already being done on a fairly regular basis, or what should at least be done on a regular basis. However, there are some very important caveats here. Currently, as in before the agreement is signed, what U.S. aid looks like is it's basically ad hoc, meaning that unless the president or Congress decides to send an aid package to Ukraine, nothing is being sent, and there is no timetable to get the next package out the door. What you might end up having is what we had, earlier this year, where you have a large gap in time between packages, and that can lead to some significant problems for Ukraine. What Ukraine needs right now is regular intervals between aid. They need a reliance that basically this aid will be continuing into the future, and something a bit more long-term and formal to keep that happening. Now, if something were to happen, like say an election in the United States, then that flow of aid might get heavily disrupted. A formal security agreement, however, will really go a long way in preventing those kinds of disruptions from impacting the flow of aid. Like, say, an election coming up, if, say, like there were doubts on one of the candidates and what they would do regarding aid to Ukraine, then this agreement would really make it at least more difficult for that candidate, if they were elected, to basically stop the aid from flowing to Ukraine. Whereas before, all they would really need to do is just stop sending ad hoc aid to Ukraine. But in this case, they would have to fully pull out of a security treaty, and there would be diplomatic and political implications that would go with that. So really, there is an incentive for President Biden to sign this agreement with Ukraine to make sure that aid does continue to flow to Ukraine longer term. Ukraine's in a better position longer term, and they can begin medium to long range planning based on, regular aid at a regular interval from some formal treaty. And then again, that aid is insulated from any kind of political turmoil that might happen in the United States. Now, while this will cement longer term U.S. aid to Ukraine, will this bring the United States closer to war with Russia if it's signing a security pact with a country that is involved in a high intensity conflict with Russia? Well, no. This really just appears to be a formalization of the status quo. There's more domestic political risk to the United States, really, than anything. Now, there are still open questions about the U.S. aid to Ukraine, and there are risks, however, where the U.S. could still get drawn into this conflict. For instance, Ukraine has received a lot of weapon systems from the United States, and it wants to strike Russian targets in Russia. They not only want to target Russian troops on the ground with a platform like ATACMS or with artillery shells that have been provided to it, but they also want to want to target Russian aircraft in the airspace using like a Patriot missile battery. One incident actually saw this happen where Ukraine targeted a series of Russian aircraft over Belgorod and downed a series of helicopters and fighter jets, and they did so with Patriots. However, this led to a lot of anger and fear in the United States on what the Russian reaction would be, that the U.S. is providing it direct equipment and weapon systems for this war. Then Ukraine's using that to destroy Russian military infrastructure and equipment inside of Russia. Russia has made repeated threats, not just to the United States, but to other countries like the UK and France as well, that if U.S. weapon systems or any other weapon systems provided by the West to Ukraine were to be used in Russia, then Russia would have no choice but to start targeting infrastructure outside of Ukraine that helps facilitate the movement of those weapon systems to Ukraine. And this might just be an empty threat. A lot of Russian threats thus far appear to have been empty, and it would do Russia well to not make good on any of those threats. However, President Biden is still incredibly risk adverse, and he's not the only Western leader that is risk adverse. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is also incredibly risk averse, and they would rather not find out if Russia actually means it the hard way. And so, as a result, Ukraine has been restricted on what it can and cannot target with U.S. and Western weapon systems. It can target Russian troops in Ukraine, which it has done so very effectively. However, it cannot target Russian troops in Russia, and this has led to things like the Kharkiv offensive, where Russia massed forces and Ukraine was able to watch it. Ukraine was able to target it with Western systems, however, they did not have permission, and so that offensive kicked off, and really there was nothing Ukraine could do about it until after they were in Ukraine. Now, if Ukraine could use Western weapon systems in Russia, then it could disrupt Russian operations in Kharkiv and other parts of the front, as well as a potential Russian offensive in Sumy province, which is north of Kharkiv. Now, we're seeing a lot of these constraints actually being lifted. In fact, the majority of Western countries have already formally and officially lifted their restrictions, so Ukraine can use their weapon systems in Russia. That notably includes the UK, which has sent several long-range fires platforms. The United States also appears to be softening on the stance with the lifting of these restrictions for, like, say, Patriot air defense batteries, targeting, Russian missiles and aircraft over Russia, as well as the lifting of restrictions on artillery and long-range fires platforms in Kharkiv, but specifically just Kharkiv, no other areas around that area. Specifically in Belgorod, but just specifically targeting Russian troops in Belgorod, neighboring Kharkiv, not other parts of the front or other parts of Russia. Now, even with these restrictions being lifted, there are still ways that Russia can exploit these limitations even just more broadly. For instance, Belarus is really kind of their ace in the hole in this whole situation. Belarus is obviously not a party into this conflict. However, they have facilitated the movement of Russian troops into Ukraine, especially early in the war, but also the rotation of Russian troops for training purposes, as well as the rotation of Russian aircraft. There are, of course, concerns that Russia might attempt to mass forces in Belarus once again for another strike on Kiev. Of course, the last time didn't go so well, but perhaps this might be a little different, being as now they know what they can and can't do. They can't do a lightning strike, but they can attempt to do a grinding offensive, at least on paper. And of course, they'll be able to mass forces in Belarus because, again, Belarus is not a party to the conflict. So Ukraine's put in a quandary even with their own weapon systems. Do they target Russian forces in a country that is not part of the conflict and risk drawing them into the conflict, or do they just wait for the Russian forces to cross the border? And of course, this is just the question with their own weapon systems. I would imagine that Western weapon systems would be a complete no-go for use in Belarus. Now, I mentioned before that there is a risk to the U.S. being drawn into this conflict over this entire weapons use situation. And there is still kind of a risk of that happening. Again, there's the risk that Russia might actually attempt to make good on their promise that they will target infrastructure outside of Ukraine supporting the weapons transfer. However, I think that that would be a terrible decision for Russia. And I think that what we're more likely to see is something less overt, something a little bit more gray zone, like, say, random explosions at train yards or random explosions at ammunition points or fires in different places. Different acts of sabotage that attempt to disrupt the flow, but nothing so significant as, like, say, a missile strike. Now, what I would also like to see is overt comments that you've sent into the comment section sharing your thoughts on this whole situation. What do you think about the new military pact between the U.S. and Ukraine? What do you think about the lifting of, the use of weapons in Russia? And, leave a like, to help this video start to reach new audiences. Liking this video really helped this video reach new audiences on their territory. And subscribe to make a long-term impact. And with all that, I'll be seeing you all next time. Later.